So I'm going to present today results from a secondary study from a much larger project where we were looking at type 2 muscle fiber properties and reactive balance. I'm going to start just by mentioning something we're probably all aware of. The lower limb muscle tendon unit properties decline with aging. And there are many examples of this in the literature. Here's just one from a review we performed a few years ago of studies looking at both muscle and tendon properties. And we see that in older adults compared to younger adults, there are typically 20 to 30% reductions in muscle strength, tendon stiffness, and tendon Young's modulus in the lower limbs. And this obviously has implications for locomotion as we age. We also know from lots of literature spanning quite some years that lower leg muscle strength, muscle power, and muscle quality have all been linked to falls in older adults, either retrospective falls or prospective falls. It's also been well established since about the 1960s that most falls occur due to large mechanical disturbances like slips and trips while walking. And this is for all ages, but of course the consequences of falls are more drastic for older adults. From laboratory-based studies, we know that leg muscle strength shows small to moderate correlations with balance recovery. And this is one reason why strength training is purported as a fall reduction intervention. But the most recent Cochrane meta-analysis reported that strength training alone as an intervention does not significantly reduce falls in daily life in older adults, only when combined with other training such as balance training. Muscle mass declines with aging have been reported to be mostly due to muscle fiber type 2 atrophy. And also when we do strength training interventions, the restoration of muscle mass is again mostly accounted by type 2 muscle fiber hypertrophy. There has been one study that has linked type 2 muscle fiber atrophy in older women with hip fractures as the result of a fall, where women with a fall-related hip fracture had more type 2 muscle fiber atrophy than older women who had no hip fracture due to a fall. So for all of these reasons, the aim in this study was to examine whether or not type 2 muscle fiber characteristics associate with reactive balance during walking in young and older adults with a range of muscle fiber type properties. And again, based on what we know from these kind of indirect and observational studies, that there would be a small to moderate relationship between type 2 muscle fiber characteristics and stability recovery following a large perturbation during walking. And this was looking at muscle fiber size and also the proportion of the muscle fiber types and the number of recovery steps needed following a novel unexpected perturbation. So for our participants, we took participants from the larger study that I mentioned before, all participants who underwent muscle biopsies and completed the walking perturbation experiment in the larger study were included, and this gave us the participants you see on the screen. The larger study was also interested in comparing exercise and physical activity levels between older adults. This group comparison is not too critical for the current analysis, but you can see from our characteristics that we have quite a range of physical function, which is useful for our analysis. We had some secondary parameters that I'll just briefly mention. We assessed upper leg muscle volume using MRI scan images, and we assessed muscle strength at the knee extension and flexion using a biodex. But our primary outcomes were the fiber typing from muscle biopsies. So this was a muscle biopsy from the vastus lateralis that was frozen and stored, and immunohistochemical staining was performed in order to color the type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers, and you can see an example in the screen here. The green stained with the MHC1 is the type 1 fibers, and the black are the type 2 fibers. And using these images, and image J, we determined the fiber size by measuring the cross-sectional area, and we also calculated the distribution, firstly as a percentage of the total number of fibers and as a percentage of the total cross-sectional area. For our walking perturbation experiments, we used the computer-assisted rehabilitation environment, which is a combined motion capture system and dual belt force plate instrumented treadmill. And we used a reduced motion capture marker set based on a previous validation study that we have used before in similar experiments. All participants were familiarized to the treadmill by walking at multiple different speeds. And also because of the range of function in our group, we also performed a stability normalized walking speed calculation. What this does is basically mean that when we start the perturbations, all participants are walking at approximately the same stability level, which is not necessarily guaranteed if we have people of different functions walking at their self-selected speed. So it gives us a bit more control on the perturbation outcomes. In this video, you can see an example of the perturbation. We had a dual belt treadmill, and the perturbation was a 3 meter per second squared acceleration of one of the treadmill belts during the stance phase, and this causes a loss of balance in the forward direction. We performed this repeated times. The first time it was applied to the right leg, the second time to the left leg, and then we also had repetitions on the left leg. In this analysis, we looked at the first perturbation to each leg. So in other words, a novel perturbation that had not been experienced to that leg before. We also look at adaptability with the repetitions, but I won't go into those results in detail today. For our stability outcome, we used the extrapolated center of mass concept, or the margins of stability, which was described before, where we look at the relationship between the base of support, boundary, and the extrapolated center of mass. And this has been previously adapted for our reduced marker set and for treadmill walking in a validation study. And you can see here a schematic of how the body configuration might look when the MOS is positive or gives a stable value on the left, which is when the XCOM is within the base of support boundary, and an unstable position where the MOS is negative, and that's when the XCOM exceeds the base of support boundary. In order to be able to perform the correlations, we looked at the number of recovery steps that the participants required, and we did this in two ways. As we've done in previous studies, we looked at the 10 pre-perturbation steps, calculated a mean and standard deviation of those as a measure of each participant's natural variation in unperturbed walking. And the first threshold was a 5 centimeter threshold for all participants, meaning that once a perturbation was applied and a drop in stability was seen, recovery was when these steps were consistently within 5 centimeters. However, again, because of the range in function, there's quite a large range in baseline variability, meaning that this set threshold might not really apply for all. So we also used an individual threshold, which was 3 standard deviations. And as you can see as an example here, using these two methods, you would get a slightly different number of recovery steps. However, there's no gold standard or consensus in the literature for the best way to determine this. So in our results, we used both of these methods and reported the outcomes of both. So firstly, I'm showing the results of the muscle fiber characteristics. Again, as I said, for this current analysis, the group comparisons are not the most critical thing, but it's good to note here that the three figures show the fiber content percentage, the mean fiber cross-sectional area, and the cross-sectional area percentage from the type 2 fibers. And what you can see is that there's quite a large range in each of these within and across the groups, which is useful for our correlation analysis because it means we have a very diverse sample. And just worth noting that, of course, the trained older adults who were predominantly endurance trained show a lower percentage of their cross-sectional area coming from type 2 fibers, as you might expect. Also looking at the recovery steps for the perturbation 1 on the top 2 panels and the perturbation 2 on the bottom 2 panels, either using the standard threshold or the individual threshold. We didn't see group differences here, but what you can see is that there's a large range in the number of steps that people required, which is again useful for our correlation analysis. For those correlations, we performed Spearman correlations on the 3 fiber type properties and these 4 recovery step criteria. And as you can see, we found no significant correlations, and even the R values were small and going in both directions. In order to just, confirm these results, we also performed correlations between the perturbation recovery and these other muscle parameters that we measured. And again, we saw similar things. We had 20 correlations here in total, and only 1 was significant, which is exactly the type 1 error rate. So really not much association here. A few additional results that we used just to check. If we exclude the young adults from this analysis, it didn't change the general outcome. So we maybe could expect some age-related differences playing a role, but that doesn't appear to be the case. And we did check that the fiber characteristics and the muscle volume and strength characteristics were strongly and consistently associated. So we are confident that our measurements are measuring what they should. So just a few conclusions. Type 2 muscle fiber properties are not significantly associated with reactive balance recovery in this walking perturbation task. And upper leg muscle volume and strength also fail to show a significant relationship. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that strength testing or training that primarily targets muscle tissue properties may not capture critical elements of muscle function relevant for reactive balance control. And this may give some explanation for the meta-analysis results we see in the literature looking at strength training interventions. If these interventions have only used very general, like weight resistance machines that don't really train any of the functional characteristics of muscle contraction relevant for gait and stability recovery. Finally, I would like to acknowledge the co-authors and also the larger study team and the research group, as well as people who contributed to the manuscript that we're working on and measurement and technical support, and of course the broader project funders. And just to mention that a few of these results were recently published as part of a larger paper from the project in Nature Communications, if people are interested in checking that out. Thank you very much for your attention.